Joining us now is former Congressman Joe Garcia of the 26th District of Florida. He is a Democrat. He is also the co-chair of the Mercury Consulting, which is a public relations firm. He was also formerly the executive director and president of the Cuban American National Foundation. Congressman Garcia, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. So let's get started. Tomorrow, the polls will close. Florida will start counting its votes. There's an old saying that Florida never votes the same way twice. And so I think my first question is, because we've shattered previous early voting estimates by hitting 8.7 million early votes in Florida. Last election, 9.6 million Floridians cast a ballot total, and only favored President Trump by about 1.2%. Governor Ron DeSantis has claimed that the Sunshine State is more inclined to lean towards Donald Trump in 2020 than he was in 2016, citing new taxes, regulatory burdens in Democratic states, left-wing radicalism, as he would say, and a severe COVID response by Democratic governors. What would you say to the governor's claim of a hidden Trump landslide?
Well, I don't think anything that Trump does is hidden, and clearly, while I at some point would have thought that there might be hidden Trump voters, I think more than anything, more likely you're going to have hidden Democratic voters who simply don't want to confront the sort of vile nature that our politics has become, particularly in the South, in this southern state and in Florida. But look, I think several things that they did right? And again, it was wrong for public health, but they had a very vigorous door-to-door campaign, and they literally caught up with us in voter registration during the downtime of COVID, right, where everybody was sort of pulling back and they were stepping forward. And to some degree, the Democrats, what they did was an incredible early vote process where they didn't register as many voters, but they got a lot of their people to turn into absentee ballot and early voters. So we're going into an election day with the highest number of votes ever in the can. Right now, the Democrats, and I didn't see last night's numbers should have favored the Democrats. We're probably going to go into the election or into election night with about 100,000 party advantage in terms of people that have voted. But again, in election day, you probably have at least a 20 to 25% vote that's still out there to come in. So we're going to shatter all previous records. I've looked at the polling. I've looked at some of the internals. South Florida is not performing as well as the Democrats would have liked in terms of early vote, or voter parity to the other party. But across the state, every poll's got us 1 to 3 to 4 points ahead. So while I think Governor DeSantis is sort of talking about some kind of surprise that'll happen election day, I don't think that's the case. In Florida, as a general rule, the early voters, and in particular the absentee ballots, have always been a strength of the Republican Party. And so I have to assume that much of that has come in. So we'll see. Election day will decide a lot. But while I have great respect for Governor DeSantis, he and I got elected at the same time in Congress. I am not a big believer that we're going to be surprised tomorrow. If anything, I think the Democrats are in a good position and they've got momentum going into this election.
Staying on that topic of voter registration and ballots cast, despite Florida's voting to restore the rights of rehabilitated felons to vote, the state legislature, and in part Governor DeSantis himself, have placed a few obstacles in their path to voting, including paying for the legal fees of their trials. Wealthy individuals like Michael Bloomberg have made efforts to forgive some of these debts, but many of them still owe the state. And the actions of philanthropists like Mr. Bloomberg only affect so many. How do you believe the state's actions will affect the results on Tuesday from that voting bloc?
Well, let me give you two views on that. The first is, I think anytime government restricts people from voting is a bad thing. And I believe that every citizen should have a right to vote, because the franchise makes you part of the system and gives you your chit in the game. And I think everyone should have the opportunity to vote. And Florida was one of the last, and still is, because of DeSantis and the legislature's motion to make them pay penalties and costs, court costs, as well as levies fined by the courts against them or outstanding judgments. That's my first position, and I think it is reprehensible what the governor and the legislature have done. But on a secondary point, I don't think it's going to have much of an effect, because we have found, after pretty serious studies of some of these voters, what we found that while Democrats believe that a huge portion of this vote was naturally for them, with this type of revived Republican Party, or this new Republican Party, which is based to some degree on xenophobia or race classification. One of the things we found that when we polled felons that had a right to have their voting record restored, we found that under this Trump rubric of the Republican Party, many of them were voting for Trump, right? And so there is this racial divide that is accentuated by our jail system, right? The tribalism that goes on in the jail system itself. And so we don't think that we would have been a great net winner. Clearly, the Republicans thought we would have, and that's why they haven't given them votes. But I've seen the studies, and obviously, I wish they were voting, but I don't think it's going to be determinative of the outcome.
Moving on to issues facing South Florida and issues that have always been important to South Florida. You're the son of Cuban refugees. You graduated from Belen Prep, which was relocated, pushed out of La Habana when Castro exiled the Jesuits.
It was his alma mater.
Yeah, it was his alma mater. You're the former president of the Cuban American National Foundation. And as a congressman, you joined your fellow Cuban congressmen, both Republicans and Democrats, in requesting or urging the Obama administration to maintain Cuba's state terror classification under the State Department. President Obama ended up normalizing relations with Cuba the first time. They were thrown back into flux under the Trump administration. If a Biden administration were to renormalize relations with Cuba, would that possibly affect Cuban support for the vice president, especially in your district, which is a majority Cuban? And would you approve of that move?
Look, I mean, there's a lot of things to unpack in that question, but let me begin by saying mea culpa, right? If I had it to do all over again, probably it was political impetus that sort of made me look at that as an issue, right? Because anytime you touch Cuba, you touch a policy that has great sensitivities, right? Whether it's when you deal with the issue of Israel in the United States, it's a lightning rod for people who have one view or another. Cuba and Cuban Americans have very set views on Cuba policy, and I for one is someone who's occupied almost every bit of that spectrum, except actually being a communist or supporting the government of Cuba. But what I do believe is that Joe Biden is going to try to go back to the Obama policy. But that policy he should get there by looking at what are in the best interest of the United States and what is in the best interest of the people of Cuba. Beyond whether we want to see change or not in Cuba, it should be based on what is the best interest for the United States. So we've had a basically static policy, with the exception of the last 2 years of the Obama administration, that basically called for a sanctions regime where we tried to force change from without. If you look at one place where we've had much more severe sanctions and the effects it had, like Venezuela, where quite literally here is the richest country in natural resources in the hemisphere, is in total collapse. Now, most of that has to do with the incompetence of the government of Venezuela. Likewise, I don't think the embargo is the be-all, end-all that has made Cuba such an economic disaster. But what I do think is that what we do know is that societies change from pressures from within, not pressures from without. What dictatorships want is a looming threat from outside. The less real, the better, and the embargo's effect is relatively small if you really think about it. But of course, this administration has played into what Cuba is particularly good at is playing David to our Goliath. But the truth is that I think we will begin to move back if if Biden went back to that policy. But it also requires Cuban Americans to engage, and many of us have either lacked the courage or showed the forcefulness necessary to make that happen. Just like the Cuban government, I think, in its heart of hearts, realizes how it missed the opportunity that the Obama administration offered. Now, that said, I mentioned enemies from without. We've got an election where we're running against communism, which is akin to, 100 years ago running against mercantilism, right? A failed economic system that no longer operates anywhere in the world. Well, communism likewise, right? The real communist countries in the world, I guess you could say, is Cuba, and I don't think Cuba is a threat to America. The Chinese party that run the Communist Party in China, that runs the government of China, is in essence a capitalist system. So I think this fear of communism is overblown, but it's one that plays very strongly in South Florida, right? And this fear of socialism and what it brings. And people in my generation, this is almost a Pavlovian response, and I think that's what the president is playing to. So I think the president is going to do quite well in the Cuban American community. I think he'll hit the low 70s, mid 70s with the Cuban support, which is pretty monolithic and unfortunate from my perspective. But it also plays to the absurdity of the argument. Lenin had a great line about this. He says history repeats itself. The first time is a tragedy, and the second time is a farce. That's what we're living here, right? The idea that we're somehow in fear of this country that is no longer a threat, no longer a world leader, an economic basket case where its founders are either dead or retired, and that we somehow fear that the United States is going to adopt this failed economic model is an absurdity. But nonetheless, in South Florida, it has tremendous strength from those who've been direct victims of communism and communist rule.
Staying in South Florida, but moving more specifically to your district, you were the first congressman from the 26th district. Prior to that, you had run against Mario Diaz-Balart in the 25th. You were the closest that a Democrat has ever gotten to unseating a Diaz-Balart brother. But you made your way into the 26th after that district was created, and you ran against David Rivera. Now your 2 times over successor, Debbie Mucarsel-Powell, is fighting a hard-fought battle against Carlos Jimenez, who is for those who don't know, the mayor of Miami-Dade County, but seems to have recovered a lot of the ground in her race. It's still a hard-fought battle, but she's recovered at least some of it. Is the 26th district finally falling in line with the party, or is this kind of a final push as a referendum against Trump in Miami-Dade, the Keys, and Monroe counties?
I honestly think that Biden is going to win that district by I think a substantial margin. I do think she's got a tough race because this is one of the few places where COVID played to the advantage of the incumbent. He was sitting the mayor of the largest part of the district, which is Miami-Dade County, as you mentioned. So he was on TV all the time and basically a household name. It forced Mucarsel-Powell, who had less name recognition, to start from a disadvantage. But I've been looking at some of the internals and other people have been polling. I think it's a pretty tight race, but I think it's going to lean Democratic. I think she's going to probably win it. But that said, you bring up the point, does this seat finally go to the Democrats? Well, it may have finally come to the Democrats, but we're also approaching the census. So Florida is going to get 1, if not 2 more congressional seats. It means almost every seat in the state is going to be redrawn, this being one of them. I do think that it'll be tough to turn this into a Republican seat. I think Republicans have more to fear when you break that up in South Florida, but we'll see. But I do think she's right now in a dominant position, and she should be able to pull this race off.
Wonderful. And my final question, which is looking to the future. You were President Obama's director of the Office of Economic Impact and Diversity at the U.S. Department of Energy before you were congressman from the 26th district. If you were to be contacted by the Biden transition team, would you consider joining a possible Biden administration?
Probably, well, look, first off, no one should ever turn down their president in either party when they get asked to serve their country. It's just a great honor. But I'm hoping not to do that. I've given the majority of my life, adult life, to some form of public service. And while I enjoy it tremendously, I also think it's time for a new generation. In particular, your generation, the generation right ahead of you, which is a huge wave that's coming through government. And while we may have the oldest candidate in our nation's history running for president, that doesn't mean that these positions which effectuate government enact, these political appointees shouldn't be engaged. These Gen Xers shouldn't be starting to take their roles and their places. There's a lot to do for each citizen from outside, and I have the great benefit of having a lot of good friends in Congress who I've worked with throughout the years, and there's a lot to be done. But my hope is that they are going to be better people than myself to fill these slots, and that it's a great opportunity for new people to serve the government.
Well, Congressman Garcia, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you being here. And hopefully by the end of, I guess, tomorrow night, when people are watching this tonight, we will have an answer to who will be the next president of the United States.
That is, I am as hopeful as you, even more so that this will be over by tomorrow night. All the best, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, sir.